Hello, and welcome to Grade.com Talks With. Today, we're talking with Lisa Henry, Secretary General at International Rehabilitation Council for Torture Victims, an organization that ensures that torture victims are able to access appropriate health-based torture rehabilitation services. And if you're new to our podcast, please press subscribe button either on YouTube or your podcast app, because today we're going to learn about an organization that envisions the world without torture. Hello, Lisa. Welcome to Grade.com Talks. We're excited to have you here.
I'm really happy to be here. So thanks, Karim, for the invite.
Wonderful. Could you please describe your organization for someone who is not familiar with your work?
Okay. And that's a great opportunity. So IRCT is called a non-governmental organization. We're based out of Denmark, and it's actually a global movement. So we are composed of 161 rehabilitation centers, where the staff of those centers are helping torture survivors on the rehabilitation journey to rebuild their lives. And the staff of those centers are also working on reparation and justice and prevention of torture. So in 161 centers around the world in 76 countries. So quite a big organization, actually.
Indeed, your network seems to be great, large, very large. You mentioned 100 something in 76 countries. So torture victims, torture survivors, if you are present in those locations, they can easily access the help and get necessary services in terms of rehabilitations from your network of organization of rehabilitation centers. Could you please describe what is a torture and what kind of tortures do exist in today's world?
Yeah, well, that's a really good question. I mean, torture is something that's perpetrated by the state or by, public officials. And it's usually for the purpose of getting information. It's torture, it's ill treatment, it's degrading treatment. In fact, it's usually very heinous crimes. It can be everything from standing in a cell with your arms in the air for hours. It can be hanging on a hook. It can be being exposed to sunlight for endless hours. It can be being deprived of water. It can be having the bottoms of your feet, where it's very tender, beaten by a stick. Recently in Belarus, it was just with metal rods being beaten across the soldiers as human rights defenders and activists were in the streets. In Myanmar, we've also seen this kind of action. So torture is ill or degrading treatment. It's perpetrated most often by the state or a public official for the means of, getting information or impeding activists from stating their opinion. And it's going on, in fact, these days, we believe, in 141 countries in the world. Exactly. And not many people realize that it's going on today. They think it's a thing of the past. Torture is going on today in many countries around the world. It's appalling, and it should be stopped.
Yeah, when you mentioned about the types of torture being used, I was thinking about movies that are shown in the movies from 16th century, 17th century, 18th century, and you don't think that something like that to a large extent, you mentioned 184 countries is happening today, but your work and the statistics are showing that it's a quite widespread practice, and that's very shocking. That's very sad. And you mentioned it's used by government for political services and to make people say information that maybe they don't want to say or don't feel comfortable saying. But it's still incredibly sad. Why do you think it still is being used to such large extent in 184 countries? We live in the 21st century. Everything, the quality of life has improved. The human rights, there are a lot of legislation protecting human rights in most countries. So why does this still happen?
Well, that's also a good question. And the number, in fact, the most recent study was done by Amnesty International, and that was back in 2014, and the number is 141. Mm-hmm. So it's 141 countries we believe torture is going on in. There is a convention against torture, mm-hmm. In which there are 171 states that have signed up. So you would think that, in fact, the legislation is in place. There's also something called the Comment 14, or the Article 14, of that convention, which requires states to provide services for those who have been tortured. So it shouldn't happen, but if it does, then there should be rehabilitation services available, right? Unfortunately, neither of those things are actually being lived up to by all states, parties to the convention these days. Why is it still going on? Well, that's a good question. I think it's because there are states that and authorities who feel that it's still beneficial for them. They're still able to control populations. They're still able to manipulate and treat people with a lack of respect for basic human rights. And the mechanisms that we have sometimes in the humanitarian system, the architecture, you could call it, are maybe not always as effective as we would want them to be. I mean, there is rule of law and there is legislation in place. There is the Convention Against Torture called the CAT, and states are called on a rotating basis to actually, go to a test to say, how are we doing living up to the different conventions and the treaties that we signed up to? And it's at that time that civil society organizations can contribute their comments and give evidence to say, there is this, the state has signed up, they should be living up to it, but we have evidence that this is going on. So this many atrocities have happened, this many cases are still going on. And so we try and use evidence collected in a very particular way to prove the case. And hopefully we win some of these strategic litigation cases, and then we can actually profile that this is going on and it has to be stopped. Mm-hmm. The other piece of work we do is the work on rehabilitation, right? So can you imagine a human being being subjected to this kind of treatment by their fellow person, right? Mm-hmm. They've been discriminated against and tortured, maybe because they are LGBT, right? And many countries of the world consider this to be an illegal practice to express your gender identity in that way. And it's actually then people are taken into jail and then tortured because of their gender identity. Those incidents are incredibly traumatizing. It's incredibly damaging for a person, for your mental state, for your physical state. And so when they finally get out of detention and are able to seek help at one of the centers that we support, then it's a long process to get them back to the place where they can recognize themselves, they can be in their own body again, they can be a mom or a dad or sister or brother in the way that we know, and they can contribute back to their family with socioeconomic, some kind of job and some kind of, giving back to their family and their community. So that process can take a long time. It can take 10 sessions. It can take 12 sessions. So this rehabilitation needs to be done carefully, and it's a basic human right that people should be able to have this service available.
Absolutely. Thank you for correcting me on the number on the countries that torture is still practiced. You mentioned there are more than 170 countries who have signed the CAT Convention against the torture, but still it's being practiced. What does happen if the country has signed, is a part of the treaty, is a part of the CAT, but they still practice torture? What does international community does to this country? Do the international organization have any power over that, or just authoritarians or dictators can all them be a part of this treaty but still continue the awful work that they do using torture?
But maybe you're putting your finger on one of the biggest dilemmas we have these days, right? I mean, there is an international order, there is rule of law, and there are some, there's like an architecture that countries of the world are supposed to live up to, right? I can say, thank goodness that we have something called civil society organizations who can, raise the alarm, who can provide the documentation. We have great journalists who are out there documenting what's going on. And we, at many times, can take, from our perspective at IRCT, there are doctors and medical practitioners, right, who know the psychological and the physical evidence and can identify it in the way that then lawyers can take the analysis and the documentation, the forensic evidence we gather, and the statements that have been taken really carefully by the torture survivor or from the torture survivor in an environment where they feel they're able to speak and they want to speak. So you get the medical practitioners combined with legal professionals. And then if you have, a good communication staff or a journalist who want to cover the story, sometimes that combination, Karim, can help us to get the story out and be able to put enough international pressure on a state that they actually will choose to listen, respond to that pressure, and make the right decision, implement or live up to the legislation that they have to, that they've said they would live up to. But if we look at what's going on today in Myanmar and we look at what's going on in Belarus these days, I mean, there's a lot of evidence out there that shows it's tough going for us, but we can't stop. And we have to continue to provide the evidence and provide the services to these human beings who've been crushed by this, right? Mm-hmm. And they deserve the support, and it's their right. So this rehabilitation and getting them back on their feet. So the best part of the work we do at IRCT is that we also have this survivor engagement piece. So if you go on this journey of rehabilitation and you decide yourself as an individual, I feel strong enough now and have something I need to say, many of these survivors become advocates. And you'll see them, speaking to politicians. You'll see them advocating directly to decision makers, telling their story. And as my colleague said recently, it's not like I'm talking about, a nice vacation, the story I tell, right? I'm telling something that's incredibly shocking, but needs to be told. Mm-hmm. And so when I do it with all the power within me, but it also can have a cost on the person. So therefore we have to have the support behind that person, the psychological support, the community around them to be there for them if they're feeling, challenged by being in the spotlight like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thanks to activists, thanks for the survivors who come out of this horrific experience, but they share their experience to the international community and they draw attention to such horrible acts happening in their country, in their communities, and then civil organizations and even different governments can take actions like such sanctions or different things, pressure those authoritarians, those dictators to stop using torture. You mentioned that your organization does wonderful work on providing rehabilitation services. Could you please tell us what kind of damage does the person who has gone through the torture feels, and why, when they come to your one of your rehabilitation services, how do you work with that damage, and how this rehabilitation service impacts the next step of their lives?
Again, great questions. And I will have the caveat here that I'm not a health professional myself. Mm-hmm. But I have been in the humanitarian community for years, and I've, of course, talked to staff in the member centers. I think the very first and fundamental piece of the work we do is we listen, right? So it's creating in the center, and that's from the moment people walk in the door, an atmosphere where people feel it's safe. It can't and it shouldn't in any way look like a very, official, clinical, a bureaucratic office, because that could bring back reminiscences or reminders of what it was like to be tortured in a cell or in a public office, right? So it's creating an environment where people feel safe. It's meeting people in a way where you're human beings talking to each other. And we say we try and create an atmosphere of trust, but well knowing that exactly that trust is what's gone for a lot of these people, right? They did trust their fellow human beings before, and they were, cheated of that trust, right? So to establish that kind of relationship of trust and of comfort and of integrity, you're going to be listened to here. Because what we find a lot with torture survivors is they're often like brushed aside. Mm-hmm. Oh, it's just you telling this story. Oh, that's your imagination. Oh, you don't have the evidence. Many times if it's psychological torture, you don't have an evidence, right? It's something that, they've been like with, I can say the example of so-called conversion therapy, right? So if your sexual preference is experienced by others around in the community, religious leaders or some of the institutions to be incorrect, they will subject you to torture in order to reprogram your mind. And to be able to get to the place when these survivors come to the centers to understand what's gone on with them. So their physical body can be impacted. Some of them are using electric shocks on different parts of the body as they're forcing people to watch like erotic movies, and then they're shocking them when they see things going on to like, it's unthinkable, right? So the therapist who sits there has to go through the journey of getting to the point with the torture survivor that they are able to understand that this experience is a part of them, but it's not all that they are. And now again, I'm just paraphrasing this, but it's also to be able to place that experience as one experience you had, but not the only experience, and one that you can kind of put in a place. You can go back to it if you choose to, but you don't have to let it control you throughout your life. Mm-hmm. That's in a nutshell the idea, right? Then it can also be the physical rehabilitation that's needed, but also the mental rehabilitation, being able to be in places where there's loud noises or sudden alarm, banging and shouting. And for example, during the Black Lives Matter protest, we found a lot of the torture survivors were re-experiencing the trauma that happened during their own torture because the circumstances were quite similar. Yeah. A lot of police together, people on the streets shouting, talking, right? And then the police reacting with tear gas and beating people and shooting rubber bullets, etc. These can reawaken and re-traumatize. So the therapists who are super loyal and committed and know exactly the process to walk the torture survivor through, they establish the ground rules and they create this space where there's hopefully this confidence is established. The person is really listened to, and then they're able to see the impact by, being able to be, more at ease, be functioning in their family, and hopefully eventually being able to go back into society and get a job and support their families, or speak to politicians in the European Union, or politicians on the Capitol Hill, or fundraise for organizations, because that's the last thing I want to say. They really often want to give the message back home that they are still fighting for the cause that they were tortured for. It's important for the community back home, who may also be, suffering, that the community back home can see it wasn't, for nothing I did this. Mm-hmm. So that was a bit complicated answer. I apologize, but there's an awful lot that goes on.
Yes, indeed. The impact that you mentioned is indeed very impactful. It's not just 1 day or 2 day. You mentioned the therapy sessions take at least up to or more than 10 sessions. So you provide safe space for people to be heard again, for people to realize that their pain, they are allowed to feel their pain. But however, that pain, I really like what you mentioned, that one experience doesn't describe their whole life. So they can feel that experience, they can go back to it, but through this therapy that they go in rehabilitation services, they can close the chapter, have a closure, and move on to their life and become eventually advocates. You mentioned about talk in European Union, Parliament, talk in Capitol Hills, and advocate for the reasons that they were tortured for, and for others to know that this is still happening and they are not going to stop fighting until the issues that they fight for are resolved. So that's a beautiful end result, although the circumstances are very horrific. If someone would like to support your organization, how can they do that?
Well, we would very much like if people would like to support our organization, because that's how this organization runs, on contributions, right? So IRCT.org is our website. It's a simple one, and there's a donation button on the page. You can transfer funds. You can mobile pay if you're in the Scandinavian countries. And that's the best way to support us. Of course, it's also good to be active in your community, to talk with your kids about what's going on in this world, to sign petitions if you have that opportunity. I mean, I think we all can be active citizens about this issue, and we should. And especially on this one on conversion therapy. I mean, I think this is one of our days and our time's most pressing issues. It's going on right now in many countries in Europe, right? So if we think about, the gender profile of people in our community, they could be subjected to this. And it should be outlawed, and we've called for a global ban. So you can support the call for a global ban on conversion therapy. You can support with funding. IRCT.org.
Absolutely. The link to the International Rehabilitation Council for Torture Victims website will be provided in the description, so you, viewer and listener, can learn more about their work. And if you wish to support their organization, you can do that, and also sign the petition against using the conversion therapy. Thank you so much, Lisa. It was wonderful to get to know you, and incredible, impactful work that your organization does.
And thank you very much for inviting me. And I think it's a great program where we actually, inspire hope and give people the chance to learn about issues, but also know that it's not, there is a reason we're doing this, and it does make an impact. So thank you very much.
Absolutely. For you listening, if you enjoyed this conversation, please press like and share button, because this will show the YouTube and podcast algorithm that this conversation is important, that we need to stop using torture and take care more about humans. Thank you, and see you in the next episode.